as I get older, Metal Gear Solid 3 begins to show more and more of its age. Of course, even when the game first came out, I was perfectly willing to acknowledge how limited this game was compared to something like Zelda, how Nintendo produced way better games, how this game was very stiff and unresponsive, and how the controls made no sense, and how this game was far too simplistic for the stealth genre. This was a game from the get-go that was almost entirely carried by the cutscenes and the voice acting. Back in the 2000s, this was a very uncommon thing for a video game franchise to have such a well-thought-out, cohesive story. And as a result of that, a lot of people were willing to overlook this game's flaws from a storytelling perspective because there simply wasn't a whole lot like this. And when you compare it to actual Hollywood films, you do feel as if this game does have quite a lot of unique aspects to it. The chase sequence at the end is quite a bit longer than what you would see out of a traditional Hollywood film. It's more involved. There's more going on. There's more crazy aspects to it. You see things that you would never see in an actual full-length production. So in a way, Metal Gear Solid 3 was able to establish itself as a classic simply due to its lack of real competition. But over time, as gaming has become more advanced and we've gotten more and more games and more stories told in the medium, and developers have grown and evolved and put out more and more games, it has become increasingly clear to me that Metal Gear Solid 3 was always, to a certain extent, extraordinarily overhyped. This is a series that carried itself entirely on excelling at a very specific thing that just could not compete with modern games. Playing this game again after such a long hiatus, about a decade, it should have been this glorious return to form. It should have been this great comeback. It should have been me revisiting and relearning this classic. I would have learned how to fight all the bosses. I would have relearned all the lore. I should have gotten drawn into the story. But the simple fact of the matter is, Metal Gear Solid 3's story does not work. And before I played it, I would have said that was because of the sequels and how that botched the story. But upon playing all of the original games, Metal Gear Solid 1, 2, and 3, I can now safely say that these games were never very good. They were never well produced. They were never that fun to play. And they were entirely carried by the idea that these were good, well-written stories. And the simple fact of the matter is, that's not true. Especially for Metal Gear Solid 2, a fact that I've expanded on in my review for that game. But for Metal Gear Solid 3, a game that I previously held in such high regard, it came as a bit of a shock at just how much I did not appreciate certain story elements and what the game actually is supposed to be about. Because when you peel back the layers to this game, when you really try and figure out what this game is trying to say and what it's really trying to do, what you get is that Metal Gear Solid 3 is trying to show you on the boss as a character. The literal girl boss who only wanted what was best for everyone and is the greatest, most beautiful person in the history of Metal Gear, and would go on to kind of define what the series would be going forward. And that definition, the themes of Metal Gear Solid 3 and the fallout going forward not only butchers everything the series would be after that point, it would also ruin the entire legacy of Metal Gear. The existence of the boss, her role in this game, and just the sheer attempts at trying to sell her as a character completely ruin the experience. And this is something that I've talked a little bit about with people online, and it really took me back to 2014 when the girl boss thing started becoming a meme, when people started addressing how Hollywood writers were going to extraordinary lengths to try and sell people on their strong female leads, and how they were trying to undermine traditional values and male characters, girls can do everything boys can do, but better. It was always very interesting to me how the narrative at the time was that the boss was a very well done example of that archetype. Back in the 2000s, it was kind of universally accepted that the boss was just this phenomenally well written character, that the ending to Metal Gear Solid 3 was this really tragic, poignant kind of story that really made the entire situation more, had this severe melancholy. And the ending to Metal Gear Solid 3 was seen as one of gaming's all-time best. It was seen as something that had a lot of depth to it, that it had a lot of impact. It was seen as something that gave the boss this incredible, like, overarching influence over the story. Like, it was supposed to be the event that set Big Boss down the path that he would eventually go down. Forming Outer Heaven and becoming, like, the overarching antagonist of the first two Metal Gear games. Like, it was supposed to be this huge, like, lore revelation and a huge, like, game changer, like, kind of clearing up the lore and, like, making a handful of retcons. This was supposed to be like the origin story of Metal Gear Solid in a lot of ways. And it's so interesting playing this game with, like, the context of not only, like, the stories as a whole, but history and where we're going as well. Because looking at the boss as a character, you really see that she fundamentally does not work as a concept. The reason why people have this idea that she's this great character and this great person, that she's this, like, amazing character, is because Snake and Eva tell you she's an amazing character. Like, oh man, she's a really good fighter because Snake can't beat her in a fight. Oh man, Eva, she's a great person because Eva tells us she is at the end. No. But if you actually take a step back and look at the cutscenes, what exactly does the boss do in the story? Like, take your time. I'm not joking here. Like, if you actually think about, like, the boss's stated accomplishments and everything she's done and her involvement in the story after this game and, like, the way the characters treat her afterward, like, what exactly does the boss accomplish? Like, what you get is a character that, at her core, fundamentally makes no sense. What you get is a character that is forced into all these iconic situations. Like, she's forced into her history. Like, she's shilled as, like, this World War II hero. She's shilled as the first astronaut. She's shilled as, like, I don't know, some, like, major asset to the philosophers who would later become the Patriots. Like, she's shilled as this, like, major force in the world of Metal Gear. And the simple reality is she doesn't really live up to the hype. If you listen to her, like, her monologue at the end, where she's talking about her motivations and she's talking about her ideology, like, it's very interesting how it conflicts with, like, Eva's presentation of it at the end. Because Eva does this thing where she tries to, like, recontextualize her as, like, oh man, she was a patriot, she loved her country, she died for her country, she was based. But the actual reality is quite a bit different. The actual reality of the situation is that the boss, like anybody else, was a puppet of the Patriots, that she was doing everything she possibly could for them, for her daddy. She was doing everything she possibly could to revive the Patriots, and that was her real primary motivation. It wasn't about Snake, it wasn't about, like, America's interest, it wasn't about being, like, she was a literal Nepo baby who was doing everything in her power to preserve the influence of the organization that spawned her. That's the reality behind the character. Okay, if you actually listen to what she says at the end when she's talking about the philosophers and, like, her goal of, like, uniting the world, like, she's not giving some noble speech. It's some commie bullshit. She is a globalist. That is the purpose of the Patriots. That is their influence on the story, is that they are a stand-in for globalists, the people that control the world. Like, she is essentially advocating for the one world government and, like, for the all-powerful philosophers that just kind of control everything. She is a globalist shill. And when you take that into consideration, take that into consideration as to, like, what's happening with the plot and the story and and what this means to the characters, like, it really makes the character come off as way more sinister than she's presented. Like, because the way that the characters treat her as if she's like, oh, she's the most noble person ever. Oh, there's no such thing as an absolute enemy. Oh, we're never going to go to war with Russia ever again. Like, everything the boss says is wrong. Everything she believes is wrong. Everything she says is objectively not true. And yet you're just supposed to believe that, in the future, by guns of the Patriots, like, everybody is going to be fighting over, like, what the boss wanted. And even if she was some pure noble soul, she was not. Even if that was true, like, who cares about what some bitch wanted for the world? Okay, that's kind of my perspective looking at this as an adult, is like, why exactly is the boss more qualified to control everything than everyone else? Like, why exactly is everyone fighting to, like, oh, a world without borders, bro? Like, really, in a way, it almost comes off as like as if they're all puppets of the Patriots, because they're all doing what she wanted, which was all by extension what the Patriots wanted. They're fighting because the Patriots wanted them to fight. Again, it's this all goes to, like, how poorly written, like, Metal Gear is as a whole. Like, people love to say the series is convoluted and that it's too confusing for most people. It's too deep for you, but the reality is, like, everything the series does has been done by other writers, other creators who did it way better and kind of tied everything up a lot better. Like, these days, Metal Gear Solid is really only something that's remembered by boomers who grew up with it. Like, this is something that I think a lot of people played when they were very young and thought it was a lot deeper than it really was. I myself fell into that trap, but it's very interesting kind of getting a bit older, like learning a bit more about the political history of the time, learning more about, like, current events, learning more about, like, the game itself even, and kind of realizing just how contrived it all actually is. How none of this makes any sense, how it all just kind of breaks down and just kind of fails to result in anything meaningful. Like, it is a stereotypical example of everything wrong with Hollywood girl boss writing, And it's remarkable to me how, much like, American Beauty in the 90s, how so many people are so nostalgic for this. How are genuinely feel attached to, like, this obviously woke, subversive propaganda. And honestly, I would argue this is a major reason why gaming has gone down the toilet. Because so many people, like, ate this shit up and said it was, like, the greatest thing in the world. And it's so obvious now that it's not, that it never was, and it never will be. And what's equally interesting is how, in spite of how worshipped this game was for a long time after release, it does feel like the game is reaching the point where it's entering relative obscurity, right? This is not a game that people look back on and remember. Like, younger players aren't playing it. The remake only sold like 1 million units at launch. For a game that's supposedly one of the all-time greats, it did about as well as Silent Hill 2, relatively niche horror IP. Like, you would think a game like this would continue to do gangbusters with a proper re-release, and yet somehow it just kind of fell apart. And I do think at its core that it is because this game is dated. It is because its cliches and what it does are kind of seen as cringy now. And what we're seeing is just a lot of people, who grew up with it are just unwilling to face it. That they're unwilling to acknowledge that Hideo Kojima was never talented, that he was never a good writer, he was never a good director, he never had, like, a good overarching plan for the series. He really did just make it up as he went along. And as a result of that, all these games feel disjointed. They're not building up to anything meaningful or insightful, or they don't do anything interesting with the characters. Like, the series has been dead for a very, very long time, and we're only now in the process where we can acknowledge that. And we do need to acknowledge, like, why that is. We do need to acknowledge why this series fell off the way it did. And it was because of Hideo Kojima's communist values and what he was advocating for with this game. like, it does need to be said that, like, even subconsciously, people are rejecting this kind of ideology. Even after all the hype, all the worship, all the praise, like, this was, in a lot of ways, the Last of Us of its time. And this is the end result of that. Is that even though on paper Hideo Kojima is still being invited to Game Awards and is still being nominated for Game of the Year and getting all this like media coverage, the reality is he hasn't been relevant since this came out because he stopped producing anything that resonated with people the same way. Like, he gave up the appealing aspects that made what he did popular, the action, spy-based, cool nonsense, and he went full on into like full commie global homo Marxist bullshit, with Death Stranding, with everything he's doing now. Like, that is the current situation as we see it, is that Hideo Kojima is completely and utterly reliant on the legacy of Metal Gear Solid 3, the stuff that people remember positively, to sell his brand today. And it's very important for us as gamers, as Americans, as anti-commies, to kind of speak out against it. Like, no, as an adult, I don't like Metal Gear Solid 3. I do think it's cringe. I do think the boss is a cringe character. Like, women do not belong on the battlefield. And I don't see the character as anything more than a Nepo baby who was carried entirely by her ties to the Patriots. Like, I don't think she's an amazing person. I don't think she's like one of the best characters in Metal Gear. I don't think she's one of the all-time great video game characters. Like, the character is a complete and total joke. And it is high time that we acknowledge that.